68 million years ago, something impossible happened. A herbivore, slow, heavily armored, and incapable of running, became one of the most dangerous animals on Earth. Not because it evolved sharper teeth or faster legs, because it built a weapon. Imagine standing in what is now Montana, a Tyrannosaurus rex, the largest land predator ever to walk the Earth, stalks through a clearing. Its eyes lock onto something low to the ground, an armored herbivore, barely moving, covered in bony plates and spikes. The tyrannosaur moves closer. The herbivore does not run. It cannot. At 3 miles per hour, escape is not an option. Then the tail moves. A massive club of fused bone, wider than a man's torso, swings in a lateral arc.
The impact generates over 14,000 newtons of force, enough to shatter a tyrannosaur's leg bone in a single strike.
This is Ankylosaurus, and that tail club represents one of the most extreme defensive adaptations in the history of life on Earth. But here's what makes this story stranger than any fiction. That weapon was not built overnight. It took 40 million years of relentless evolutionary pressure to create. The question is not just how it worked. It is what kind of world could demand something this extreme. To understand what made the Ankylosaurus tail club so devastating, you need to break down the engineering. This was not just a lump of bone. It was a precision weapon system, with 2 critical components working in perfect synchronization. The handle came first. The distal caudal vertebrae, the tail bones near the end, underwent radical modification.
The prezygohypophyses, the forward-facing joint surfaces, elongated dramatically. They overlapped the preceding vertebra by at least 50% of its length. This created an interlocking pattern, like roof shingles, that eliminated flexibility entirely.
But the vertebrae alone were not enough. Running alongside them were ossified tendons, connective tissue that had mineralized into bone-like structures. These tendons formed a lattice that enveloped the entire handle, distributing stress across the length of the tail.
Without them, the massive forces generated during a swing would have torn muscles or fractured vertebrae.
The result was a rigid rod, incapable of bending, designed solely to transmit force. Then came the knob. The business end of the weapon consisted of enlarged osteoderms, bony plates embedded in the skin that had fused together into a single massive structure. In Ankylosaurus, the knob measured roughly 60 centimeters long and 49 centimeters wide. But here is the clever part. These osteoderms were not solid bone. CT scans reveal a cancellous interior, spongy bone enclosed by a thin, cortical shell. This architecture solved a critical problem. A solid knob of equivalent size would have been too heavy to accelerate effectively. The animal would have struggled to swing it, and stopping the momentum would risk injury. The cancellous structure reduced rotational inertia while maintaining a large impact surface. The physics of the strike are brutal. Biomechanical studies modeled the tail as a series of rigid segments, calculating the torque generated by the massive longissimus caudae muscles at the tail base. For large adult specimens, the knob could reach speeds of 60 miles per hour at the point of impact. The force calculations are staggering. Small clubs, typical of juveniles, generated between 400 and 1,100 newtons, comparable to a stegosaurus spike. Average-sized clubs produced 962 to 2,014 newtons, with impact stresses reaching 100 megapascals. That is enough to fracture bone. But the largest clubs delivered between 7,281 and 14,360 newtons. Impact stresses exceeded 700 megapascals. To put that in perspective, cortical bone, the dense outer layer of most bones, fails at around 150 megapascals under compression. A direct hit from a fully grown Ankylosaurus would have obliterated a Tyrannosaur tibia. The range of motion tells you everything about how this weapon was deployed. The tail could swing laterally through approximately 110 degrees, 55 degrees to either side. Vertical movement was severely restricted. The club could not be raised high or brought down from above. It was a horizontal scythe, sweeping at hip height. That geometry reveals the target. The club was designed to strike low, at the legs, ankles, and lower body of a bipedal predator. A tyrannosaur approaching from the side would expose its most vulnerable structural support, its legs. One solid hit could cripple the predator, transforming it from apex hunter to a mobile victim. But understanding how the weapon worked only raises a deeper question. Why did it evolve this way? The answer lies not in a single moment of innovation, but in a process that unfolded over tens of millions of years. The fossil record reveals something stranger than a sudden innovation. The tail club did not appear fully formed. It evolved in stages, each one building on the last, over a time span that dwarfs human civilization. The earliest evidence comes from Liaoningosaurus paradoxus, discovered in early Cretaceous deposits dating to 122 million years ago.
This species already possessed the elongated pre-zygapophyses, the interlocking vertebrae that would become the handle.
But there was no knob. The tail was stiffened and rigid, but it lacked the massive striking surface that defined later species. This presents a puzzle. A stiff tail without a club is not an effective weapon. It cannot generate the impact forces needed to break bone or to deter a predator. So what was it for? One hypothesis suggests the rigid tail evolved first for balance or stability, anchoring the massive muscles needed to support the heavily armored body. Another proposes it served as a visual display structure held straight out to signal dominance or health. The answer remains uncertain. What is clear is that the handle evolved before the weapon. Gobisaurus democulus, living around 92 million years ago, shows the same pattern. The handle is present, the knob is absent. The evolutionary pressure to stiffen the tail was acting millions of years before the pressure to enlarge the terminal osteoderms. Then came the transition. Pinacosaurus, from the Campanian stage roughly 75 million years ago, represents the first confirmed fossil with both handle and knob. This is the critical moment, the point where the weapon system became complete. But the knob was small. The oldest specimens measure only 146 millimeters in width, functional, but nowhere near the size of later giants. The progression continues. Specimens from the Nemegt Formation show knobs reaching 620 millimeters. The Dinosaur Park Formation yields clubs 572 millimeters wide. Horseshoe Canyon specimens measure 593 millimeters. Through the late Cretaceous, from the Campanian into the Maastrichtian, the clubs grew larger and more massive. This temporal trend suggests escalating pressure. Whatever selective force favored the tail club initially continued to intensify through the final 20 million years of the Cretaceous. The traditional explanation points to predators. The rise of the Tyrannosauridae in Asia and North America correlates strongly with the appearance of massive tail clubs. Ankylosaurus and Tyrannosaurus rex coexisted in the Hell Creek Formation. Tarchia and Tarbosaurus bataar shared the Nemegt Formation. Zool and Gorgosaurus lived together in the Judith River Formation. This symmetry is significant. Tyrannosaurs evolved crushing bite forces capable of pulverizing bone, a predation style distinct from the slicing bites of earlier theropods. Passive defense, like the spikes and camouflage of nodosaurs, may have been insufficient against an animal that could bite through armor. The tail club offered something different: active deterrence.
The ability to inflict catastrophic injury before the predator could close distance.
But there is a problem with this narrative. Nodosaurs, another lineage of heavily armored ankylosaurs, faced identical predatory pressures. They lived in the same ecosystems, encountered the same tyrannosaurs, and survived for millions of years. Yet they never evolved tail clubs. They relied entirely on passive armor and spikes. If predation alone drove tail club evolution, why did nodosaurs not develop the same adaptation? The answer suggests something else was at work, something specific to ankylosaurids that nodosaurs did not face. The fossil record was about to provide an answer. It came from a specimen preserved in exceptional detail, with armor still in place and injuries still visible.
In 2017, paleontologists described Zool crurovastator, an ankylosaurine from the Judith River Formation of Montana.
The name translates to Zool, destroyer of shins, a reference to the Ghostbusters creature and to what the fossil revealed about ankylosaur behavior. The specimen was exceptional, preserved from nose to tail tip, with fossilized skin still in place and armor plates positioned exactly as they were in life. But what made Zool revolutionary was the injuries. Scattered across the flanks and hips were broken osteoderms, the bony spikes that lined the sides of the body. The tips were snapped off, blunted, then healed. The bone had remodeled, indicating Zool survived these impacts and lived for months or years afterward. The pattern was unmistakable. The injuries were localized to specific zones along the flanks, exactly where another ankylosaur's tail club would strike during a lateral swing, and critically, they were bilaterally symmetrical, appearing on both sides of the body in corresponding locations. This symmetry is the smoking gun. Random trauma from predatory attacks would not produce bilateral patterns. A tyrannosaur biting the flank would leave deep puncture wounds and ragged tears, not blunt force fractures on matching armor plates. The injuries on Zool were consistent with repeated strikes from a specific direction, at a specific height, targeting non-lethal zones. Statistical analysis confirmed it. A chi-squared test showed the injury distribution was non-random, with a p-value of 0.0039. The injuries clustered precisely where ritualized combat would predict. This was not defense. This was combat between ankylosaurs. The implications cascade outward. If the tail club evolved primarily for fighting other ankylosaurs, then sexual selection, not predation, was the driving force. The club became a weapon for establishing dominance, securing mates, and defending territory. The same selective pressure that shaped deer antlers and ram horns applies here. The evidence supporting this hypothesis is compelling. The tail club shows delayed ontogenetic growth, developing rapidly only as the animal reaches sexual maturity. Structures needed for survival and defense, like the camouflage and spikes of Borealopelta, develop early because juveniles are highly vulnerable. Structures used for mating competition develop late, when the animal is ready to compete. The high variation in club size and shape within species supports this further. Sexually selected traits show individual variation because they signal health, dominance, and genetic quality. If the club were purely defensive, optimized for breaking tyrannosaur bones, you would expect standardization, a single optimal design. Instead, the fossil record shows a diversity of shapes: broad wedge-shaped clubs in Anodontosaurus, wide flat clubs in Tarchia, and massive oval clubs in Ankylosaurus. The absence of tail clubs in nodosaurs becomes explicable. They faced identical predators but evolved different social structures. Without the same intraspecific combat pressures, they never developed the weapon. The injury patterns on Zool reveal the combat tactics. Strikes targeted the flanks and hips, zones heavily armored but non-lethal if damaged. A broken hip spike would hurt and might impair movement temporarily, but it would not kill. The combatants were avoiding fatal strikes deliberately. This is ritualized combat, animals testing each other's strength without fighting to the death. The same behavioral pattern is seen in modern mammals with elaborate weapons. Bighorn sheep ram heads in tests of dominance but rarely gore each other's flanks. Elk lock antlers and push, but do not stab. Ankylosaurs swung clubs at armored zones, not at exposed necks or skulls. The tail club served a dual purpose. Against a tyrannosaur, it was a devastating deterrent, a weapon capable of crippling the predator if it pressed an attack. But within ankylosaur society, it was a tool for establishing hierarchy. The largest clubs belonged to the most dominant individuals. Combat determined access to mates, feeding grounds, and territory. Evolution does not create single-purpose tools. The club was both a sledgehammer and a status symbol, refined by millions of years of pressure from predators and rivals alike. every adaptation carries a price. The Ankylosaurus paid for its weapon in ways that shaped every aspect of its existence. Speed was the first casualty. At roughly 8,000 kilograms, distributed across a body optimized for stability rather than agility, Ankylosaurus moved at approximately 3 miles per hour. That is a human walking pace. Escape from a pursuing predator wasn't just difficult, it was impossible. The animal had no choice but to stand and fight. The low center of gravity that made it nearly impossible to flip or topple also restricted movement. Ankylosaurus couldn't rear up, couldn't knock down trees, couldn't manipulate its environment the way larger sauropods or more agile ornithopods could. It was locked into a defensive posture. Hunker down, present armor, swing the club at anything that came too close. Vision was compromised. The eyes were positioned laterally, providing a wide field of view, but poor binocular vision. Ankylosaurus likely couldn't target a specific point on a predator with precision. The 110-degree swing arc compensated for this, creating a zone of danger rather than requiring accurate aim. It meant the animal was partially blind to threats approaching from certain angles. To compensate, Ankylosaurus relied heavily on smell. Computed tomography scans of the skull reveal enlarged olfactory bulbs. The sense of smell was acute, likely the primary early warning system for detecting predators before visual contact. Hearing was moderate. The inner ear structure suggests sensitivity to low-frequency sounds, useful for detecting the heavy footfalls of large theropods or the vocalizations of other ankylosaurs. The dietary constraints were equally severe. The broad muzzle was adapted for non-selective cropping of low vegetation, such as ferns, shrubs, and soft leaves. The small, cusp-like teeth couldn't process tough, fibrous material. Jaw movement was limited to vertical motion. The animal did minimal chewing, relying instead on hindgut fermentation to break down relatively intact plant matter. Every system was optimized for a single survival strategy: stationary defense. The tail club allowed Ankylosaurus to create a 360-degree defensive perimeter by pivoting its body to keep the weapon aimed at threats. But it couldn't flee, couldn't climb, and couldn't adapt to rapid environmental changes. The weapon was perfect, but it locked the animal into a narrow ecological niche, vulnerable to any shift in conditions that its armor couldn't solve. The tail club wasn't built for a single enemy. It was refined by two pressures acting simultaneously: rival ankylosaurs and apex predators. Zuul's injuries proved the club was a social weapon first, used in ritualized combat for dominance and mates. But the sheer destructive force, 14,000 newtons, enough to shatter a tyrannosaur's leg, reveals it remained a lethal deterrent against predation. Evolution doesn't waste energy on single-purpose tools. The club served both functions because both pressures were constant. What began as a weapon for intraspecific combat became the ultimate defense against the largest predators ever to walk the earth. The question isn't whether it was for fighting rivals or predators, it was always both. If this journey into the mechanics and evolution of prehistoric weaponry left you questioning what else we've gotten wrong about the ancient world, press the like button and subscribe. There are more buried truths waiting to be unearthed.